There we go. I don't know why Amy has decided that I have to join every session slightly after our speakers. So apologies for that, Noel, and leaving you out there on your own. But welcome everybody to our next session of the PMO Leader Conference. Whether this is your first, your 10th, your 15th session today, welcome everybody. I'm Jo Candlish. I've been involved in the PMO Leader for all 5 years of this conference now and seen it go from strength to strength. It's really exciting. And in fact, I think Noel and I have met before on this very stage a couple of years ago. So it's always good to catch up and see what's developed since then, and always more to learn too. So I'm absolutely delighted we've got a session today on the lessons that Noel has learned in setting up a greener NHS trust. Just a reminder, on the right-hand side of your screens, you'll see you've got the chat function. So jump in there, let us know that you're here, let us know where you're joining us from. And if you've got questions for Noel, there's a Q&A section as well. We'll try and get to those at the end and see how many of those that we can cover. But in the meantime, we are joined by Noel, who's here to talk to us about everything that he has learned in his 20 years of experience, or 20 plus, in change functions, currently working for the UK's National Health Service, and going to be talking to us about the lessons he's learned. So I'm going to hand over to you, Noel.
Thanks very much, Jo. Lovely. Well, thanks all for attending this session. I'll move on to a little bit about myself. Jo, can you just confirm everyone can see this? I assume you'll let me know if there's any issues. Okay, so just what Jo's just mentioned there, I'm a passionate PMO professional. I've been working on sort of projects and programs and portfolios since 2003. To show my age, I've just turned 50, going on 51, and I really love sort of like working in sort of complex environments and trying to put a little bit of structure, make sure that strategy is being delivered correctly through the projects and programs that I'm involved in. Just a little bit of background about sort of some of my experiences. The start of my career, I was primarily involved in sort of working in the finance industry, Barclays, ING, did a stint at BP Solar, started my very early days in sort of like maybe greener initiatives. Took a sort of a year off driving through Africa, as you do. And when I came back to the UK, worked in sort of AXA Tech, started my sort of housing and property experience at Sanctuary Housing and at British Land. Decided that 1 year off was not enough, so I took another year off and drove through Africa again, this time with my partner and wife-to-be. When I came back, did set up a sort of, or took over a sort of head of projects at Savills, did a stint at Penguin Random House to see sort of how publishing industry works. Then this little one came along, my gorgeous daughter Lois, changed my life. Then did more stints at Landsec, which is property, did some global accountancy at ACCA, and I spent the last 3 and a bit years working at NHS Property Services. And in that time, also had a lovely, beautiful, amazing daughter as well. So I'm a dad of 2, and all of those experiences have led me to where I am today at NHS Property Services. Now, apologies, there's a fire alarm test just about to gig.
Attention, please. The fire alarm is about to be tested. Please take no action. Attention, please. Attention, please. Please leave the building immediately. Please leave the building immediately by the nearest exit. Do not use the lifts. Attention, please. Attention, please. The fire alarm test is now complete. Please respond to all future fire alarms.
Okay, forgot to add that to the risk log, but I'll start again. So the Greener NHS programme, I'll give you a little bit of context. The term net zero was termed as a global temperature limiting strategy in the late sort of 2000s, and that started to gain significant traction in the science and sort of policy communities around sort of 2014, 2015. And the UK was the first major economy that sort of legally committed to net zero emissions by, as a target, passing law in 2019. And for us as a country to achieve this by 2050. But in 2020, the NHS became the first health system in the world to set a net zero target to achieve this by 2040. For all of its directly controlled emissions. Now, off the back of that, in 2021, the Greener NHS programme for NHS property services kicked off, and we had two kind of like key sort of like outcomes stroke vision statements that we wanted to try and deliver against. First one being to decarbonise our estate, and that our estate contains around 3,000 hospitals, health clinics and GP surgeries. And our aim is to reduce its environmental impact by focusing on reducing energy, being on top of our utilities and making sure that we're environmentally compliant. And secondly, really from a cultural perspective within our organisation, of which we have several thousand people working within our organisation, we want to make sure that we're implementing sustainable practices and objectives to make sure that we're improving our data, we're reporting on our energy and water usage, we're transforming our waste management, and we're promoting greener travel and transport. Joe, can everyone see this? Sorry, are you there? Oh, here we go. Just trying to see if everyone's on the same page or not. So in terms of the issues, oh, Joe, are you there?
Yeah, sorry, Noel, we just had some problems with your presentation. So I think I am presenting. If you want to just let me know when to move on and move it around. Apologies, everyone watching, but we've managed to catch up.
If you move on to the next slide.
Certainly.
Thanks, Joe. So in terms of the issues that we were facing at the sort of like start of this journey, in the first year or two that we're working on setting up this program, you know, as a reminder, our targets were to 2040. So, you know, that's a long time ahead that we need to sort of like plan about how we're going to decarbonize those 3,000 sort of like sites. One of the things that we sort of like really saw were our data and insights are really poor. So in terms of all our asset information, in terms of like our boiler sort of information, the conditions of our assets, all of this information was kept in multiple spreadsheets. I think around sort of 30 to 40 spreadsheets that we had at the time. And imagining trying to interrogate those 30 or 40 spreadsheets, it would take hours at any one point to actually respond to any customer queries. And those customers could come from GPs, they could come from ICBs and trusts in terms of what has been done to our sites, or what are you going to do to our sites to help decarbonize their particular buildings. So major issue in terms of our data. In terms of structure to scale, so what I mean by that is we had a very relatively small team a few years ago, around sort of 8 or 9 people working on year one of this program. We didn't have sort of like any structure to deliver at scale, and we didn't necessarily understand what our priorities were in terms of laying the foundations to how we're going to deliver this. So we've got a meaningful roadmap of how we're going to decarbonize those 3,000 buildings. And lastly, from a cultural perspective, you know, net zero and trying to reduce our emissions to something so far ahead in over the next sort of 20 years, you know, that can be seen as relatively complex, and what we wanted to try and understand is why. What are the perceptions that we need to break down? What are the barriers that we've got as an organization? Business processes, are they geared up? The answer was no at the time to treat carbon reduction as a priority compared to other priorities that our organization had at the time. Thanks, Joe. If we can move on to the next slide. So I think one of the key things that most greener initiatives and probably many other types of initiatives, not just greener initiatives, is that, in order to make good informed decisions, we know that in the jobs that we perform, that we need to make sure that it's not just gut feel that we're going on, but we also need data to make informed decisions. So that was kind of like one of the sort of principles of how we started this program, that we wanted to sort of really get underneath and into the bonnet of where all the issues lie with our data, and try and get on top of that before we can actually start going and working with other functions and other groups within our organization to actually go and make some of the decarbonising projects come to life. You move on, Joe. Thank you. So some of the issues that we faced from a data perspective is accuracy was a problem. Data was missing. We were reliant on manual sources, and we didn't have a lot of confidence in our external sources. We had unclear roles and responsibilities. The sources of that data could change, and we weren't necessarily sure why and who was actually changing that data. There was unclear sort of like process activity in terms of when things should be cut off, when should data be stored and locked down, and sort of prioritization in terms of who's doing what within these spreadsheets at month end and various other reporting timeframes. It was all very unclear at the time, and an outcome of all of that, is that the reports that we were producing were inefficient. We had to remodel a lot of information. So much difficulty joining all these data sources, and the ability to extract that data was really inefficient. You move on. Thanks, Joe. So we came up with a fairly sort of like simple data strategy, and we started off with designing what the future decarbonisation tracker needed to look like. What are the insights that we want to produce? And that was obviously shared with many people that were involved in the process, many stakeholders, sponsors, heads of departments, people that are involved in, our customers, what they also want to see. So we did a massive sort of like casting of the net to understand what does the future need to look like from not only the data that we hold, but the insights and the reporting that we need to produce to actually show how we're progressing against reducing our carbon footprint. Off the back of that, we did a lot of workshops, and those sessions were really just to get to the crux of many different things in terms of how do we go about building this future tracker? How do we get people to commit time to actually sort of build, test, and also validate the data? A really important part of making sure that when you go live with something new, you want to make sure that everyone has been everyone that is impacted by that change has been part of the process to make sure that they've been involved and they're comfortable with the direction of where we're taking this. And then lastly, we didn't want to wait where we had every single technology for decarbonisation. And what I mean by technologies, I'm talking about LEDs, you've got solar, you've got air source heat pumps, to name just 2 or 3 sort of technologies that you can do to decarbonise buildings. What we decided to do was kind of like go with that MVP approach where LEDs were underway. We were implementing LED light installs in many different buildings. And so we basically just transferred the old ways of working for how we were tracking LEDs into this decarb tracker. And as soon as we went live with that, we basically cut off all old ways of how those LEDs were being tracked in various other spreadsheets. So from that day one moment, everything was done through this through this decarbonisation tracker. And that's the approach that we took to sort of like scale it up by making sure that every technology that we were fairly mature on in terms of how we put that into the tracker, we had confidence in terms of the information that was being reported on and the outputs that people were getting and the insights that we're getting from that. It was all being validated in that one place. And once we had that confidence, we could then start moving and transferring other technologies and other project implementations into this tracker. Thanks, Joe. If you can move on to the next slide. So in terms of the design, designs start with many different things, depending on what you're trying to design as a new product. What we obviously started off is what we try to resolve. What are those types of projects that we want this tracker to contain? What are the data sources that we want to capture within this tracker? Who are our customers, both externally and internally? And how do we visualize that information? What are the filters that you want to be able to see? And so we obviously looked at its core base level. We've got site level information. We then want to be able to sort of like track that at an ICS and ICB perspective, and then regionally and then nationally. So we can sort of like roll it up and roll it down depending on who's interested in what type of information from what we're doing from the projects we're implementing. And then we obviously looked at the modeling side in terms of like what are those things that we might need to do in terms of scenarios. As an example, NHS Property Services for greener initiatives, year on year, we get around 8 to 10 million in terms of capital budgets. And so that 8 to 10 million that we spend on making sure our buildings are decarbonised, on top of the capital work budgets that we already have, how do we utilize that money? What buildings do we want to work on first, and why are we working on those buildings as opposed to others? So we wanted to make sure that we're making the right choices using the data that we've got from this decarbonisation tracker. Next, Joe, if you move on to the next slide, please. So what we got here is, once we started getting that data, we started to get some really interesting insights. And what we can see on the bottom here is a list of a lot of our sites that we want to decarbonize. And what we actually started looking at is the top 100 sites, which is that left-hand side where the emissions are actually quite high. So the top 100 out of those 3,000 are the ones that emit the majority of our gas emissions. And we could obviously, using the data, that's an insight that is actually quite powerful, because from a strategic perspective, why wouldn't we try and reduce the buildings with the highest emissions first? Because ultimately we get those things right, we're well on our way to doing great things in terms of our targets, but also the environment of reducing gas emissions, from a societal perspective. And then the heat map of those 100 or 110 gas emitting sites, we could start seeing, using that data and applying, a map type GIS model, we could actually see where those sites were located. That would then help us look at sort of regional budgets and looking at capital works that's going on within those particular regions, and actually start working with those capital teams to make sure that, hey, by the way, there's some sites here that we want to work on to decarbonize. How do we get that involved into your capital work schedules over the next few years? So the data was super important for us to get to really good decision making, utilizing the money that we've got. Thanks, Joe. If you can move on to the next slide. So in summary, from trying to build better data, better insights off that data, confront the issues, I think so many programs and projects need to go through the fire, right, before you come out on the other side. And I think sort of like confronting those issues and not accepting that this is the way that we do things and this is the way that it's always been done, if it doesn't actually help you get to produce things faster and quicker and make better decisions of how things are currently working, I think the best thing to do is get people in that room and actually sort of like start openly talking about what do we need to do to be better and build something that is more sustainable. Build quick, test and validate. It's like, I think sort of don't go for that sort of waterfall sort of type methodology when you're building trackers and building reports and insights off the back of it. I think sort of like you can build quick and you can work out whether this is the right direction we should be taking things. And off the back of getting that tracker in place and starting to see the insights that you're producing, that's one thing. But then to make it sustainable and operational, there's going to be people that are involved in the maintenance of that tracker, whether they are the structural people that are responsible for that tracker, or the people responsible for updating the data within that tracker. Be clear with the roles and responsibilities and make sure you've got some sort of operational handbook that sits with it to make sure that we maintain and we keep the sort of the structure as good as we can over the next few years. Thanks, Joe. If we can move on to the next slide. So every green program needs structure. I think every program needs structure. So we can just remove out the word greener. Every program needs structure, as we all know. And a greener initiative is no different. Can we move on to the next slide, please? In terms of what we were facing when we started kicking off this program is without the structure, our priorities were not clear. Loads of amazing ideas, not necessarily a clear roadmap for how to deliver those things. We didn't necessarily know how we determine success each year. What were our in-year targets? A lot of organizations work on sort of annual budgets, not necessarily sort of like multi-year budgets, especially to 2040. So they're so far away. So how do you sort of like containerize the progress we want to make, utilizing the best use of our resources and our budgets? We were trying to achieve more than was possible. Without structure, there's probably a lot of ambition that you want to achieve, but what's the reality? What can our resources feasibly actually deliver in that year? And if we're working with other functions and other departments, what can they actually also commit to that makes sense and have best use of their time? And lastly, in terms of like, it's not just about reporting to execs, but we want to show that we are making progress and we are delivering against our commitments and we are working on things that make sense. How do you report things that to senior members of your organization and remove technical jargon, because there is a lot of technical jargon when it comes to decarbonization, especially when it comes to assets within buildings. At the time, everything was very technical, so we needed to make things easier to understand. And at the time, we were unable to give that lift update. And what I mean by that is, you get in with a senior member of your organization, you've got 10, 15 seconds to give them an update about where your program is, and you want to make sure that they're aware of what's going on and how they could potentially help. We never necessarily had that ability at the time to give that perspective very quickly to people. And lastly, we couldn't answer how are we going to bring our whole organization on the journey. Many organizations that are undertaking this or starting to think about that, you may have a decarbonization, a greener team that are sort of like setting this up and trying to deliver this. But for me, and the power is bringing others that are not in your program, are not in your department, that how do you bring them on? Because they all have different roles that they could help deliver a greener organization, a greener culture, a greener way of thinking about making decisions that will impact our environment for the better. So how do we bring those people along? Thanks, Joe. Can we move on? So I did have some animation here, but it's all in one page. What we started off to do in terms of structure is have a sort of an induction sort of guidebook to how we deliver greener projects, and that contained various chapters on our targets, on our objectives, how our department is made up of, what our challenges are to actually achieve these things, who to go to in terms of SMEs if you need to work with certain types of groups of people, how is our organization made up in terms of the hard FM teams, the capital teams, etc., that you will need to approach and speak to, what's already underway. So it's kind of like a Bible of what we're doing to deliver projects now, and this is a live document. So every time our objectives change, this document gets updated. Any of our processes get changed, this document gets updated. So it's live and there for everyone. In terms of a subsection of this guide, we created our own sort of project life cycle. And we're all familiar with different life cycles, but we created one that resonates with the people that we're working with. In terms of greener projects, we had a pilot stage, and that's where we trial and learn how we deliver decarbonisation technologies across our estate. We might pilot those within a particular region, within a particular site, to understand what efforts are needed, what were the lessons learned, what are the things that we assumed were going to work versus what the realities were, how did it reduce our emissions, how did it reduce energy. Once we got that pilot stage through and we had some good information to deliver those projects, we then moved it into an embed stage where we had a clearly defined approach, because we've been doing this for a number of times on a number of different sites. And then the sustain bit is us kind of walking away from a energy and environment perspective and handing this over to business teams. And that could be various teams depending on what the technology was, but it's almost like that handover to operations. So that was the sort of like life cycle that we came up with, something that was easy to understand, nothing too technical for some of the people that we were working with, but understood the journey of how you go from testing something new and then handing that new thing, once it's been trialed and tested, into an operational way of working, and moving that into our organization so we can then walk away, because someone else is then going to continue to deliver those things over the next few years. On the top right there, you can see a 5% reduction. So one of the things that we decided to do, which really had a massive impact, was have a company-wide objective to reduce our emissions as an organization. And initially we put down a 5% reduction based on some of the information that we use using our data and the sites that we could obviously work on. What we got is exec-wide approval to have that as a company objective. And that then makes sure that the execs and their senior leadership team are all providing progress in terms of how their functions and how their teams are working to also deliver that emission reduction. Something that I think is really important when you start kicking off these types of programs. And this might take a bit of time to get to, but I see the value in terms of like making sure it's a company-wide objective, not just a greener team objective. And then bottom right, you can see the sort of meeting schedules that we had that then fed into steering group meetings to talk about how we're progressing. Obviously, however this works for you is down to the groups of people and the stakeholders that you've got. But we found that having monthly meetings and leadership report meetings and then department meetings over a period of 3 weeks then fed into a monthly steering group meeting to talk about how we were progressing against that 5% reduction on an annual basis. Thanks, Joe. We can move on to the next slide. So that handbook that I just referred to, one of the slides and one of the pieces of work that we do on an annual basis is to agree what the objectives are of the teams that we're working with. And as an example, you can see there that the energy team, had a sort of an overarching target of delivering 90 decarbonisation projects and 3% reduction over that top 100 set of sites. And when we broke down what those specific pieces of work that needed to happen to deliver those targets and those outcomes. So it was a way of us really tracking progress and making sure that when we had meetings with the PMs and the net zero lead who was managing his team, that our meetings were focused on delivering against these objectives. And if those objectives needed to change for whatever reason, that went through change control, etc. But it was fairly well structured that we could then show risks, we could show opportunities, we could show whether we were on track or off track to meet these overarching outcomes. And on the right hand side there, you can see photos of all of this stuff needs people in a room, whether that's virtual, whether that's in person. When you set up objectives, if people are not familiar with the process and how we get to determine what success looks like for each year, we try to bring people in face-to-face meetings on a regular basis, every 2 or 3 months, to talk about how we're setting those objectives, making sure that people had views and contributed to what their roles were within those objectives. So we could then start getting owners that then fed into more detailed plans that sat behind this. I'm a big sort of supporter of getting people in rooms and making sure that everyone has a chance to talk about the challenges, the resources that they need, clarification of what these objectives actually mean to them or their teams. And we would do this sometimes over a 2-day period to make sure that by the time they walked out of it, they were fairly clear in terms of like what was needed to be delivered by themselves to meet these targets that we had set. Thanks, Joe. If you can move on to the next one. And then from a promotion of benefits, came up with the idea of a end of year report. And initially, you're introducing something new with it. You have to do a little bit of stakeholder management to talk about what is it that you ultimately would like to see. But we as a department came up with a format where we had a front page, and these front pages are sort of summaries of all the good work that we did year on year over the last 3 years on our journey for meeting our targets and reducing our emissions. So you could see top left in 22-23, we reduced our emissions by 18%, 23-24, 8%, 24-25, 7%. And loads of other information that sat behind that is the detail that sits within these end of year reports. It was well received, and now it's a regular thing that we now produce. And our annual reports also contain nuggets of bits of this information in terms of how we're performing as an organization against our green commitments. So it's just one thing that I would highly suggest, that if you've got greener initiatives, make sure that you're also talking about the successes that you and your organization have done, because it's really important to showcase those things to not only yourselves as a group to improve the culture and visibility of these green initiatives, but also make sure that your customers and anyone else that's interested in, are we actually delivering against our commitments? This is a way of sort of like validating and showing how we've done that. Thanks, Ray. And then in terms of lessons learned from a program structure, everyone understands, or you should try to understand, the pace that your teams that you're working with need to work in. So make sure that what you're introducing is something they can transition into. Don't make it too technical. Make it easier for them to sort of like adopt. Moving into objectives, that took a little bit of time to sort of like work through with some of our teams. But then I think after the first year and you start repeating that process, it becomes a lot more straightforward as each year goes by. have those difficult discussions in a room in terms of where targets and objectives are not necessarily clearly understood, until you do have clarity and you've got something that the group are able to commit to. And, get feedback. The processes that we implemented are not set in stone. They adopt, they're agile, and I think you should also be sharing your successes within your organization to make sure that we are building a wider acceptance that the emissions targets and the greener objectives are important to not just our teams, but all of us as an organization. Thanks, Joe. All right, so lastly, I'm going to be talking about just breaking down the cultural barriers. Hopefully I'll touch upon that in some of my earlier updates. It's the whole organization that can help reduce carbon, and how do you get to that as a sort of cultural way of working. Can we move on to the next slide, please? There's two things that I think sort of like we had to deal with. Complexity of the mission. Colleagues had a different range of understandings on how to reduce carbon emissions, and some had a fear or a resistance that this might be too complex for themselves in their own specific roles that can make a dent or a difference. And secondly, how do we make sure that or how did we make sure that sort of when you're implementing site-specific projects, how do you make sure that carbon reduction was not at the end of the process, which it was at the start when we undertook this? So what I mean by that is you may have a boiler replacement in a hospital, and at the start of when we went on this journey, no one within our sort of asset process ever questioned whether we should be replacing a boiler with another boiler, as opposed to, is a boiler the right technology we should replace in this end-of-life boiler with? So what we wanted to do is just try and make sure that we were at the start of the process and not at the end of our business processes. If you move on to the next slide, please, Joe. So what we tried to do is just simplify the mission. It's like to 2040. That's quite a messy overview if you're trying to talk about how you're trying to deliver projects on over a 20-year period. So we wanted to try and break this down into easy to understand phases that would get us to our targets. We wanted to highlight our successes. So like the end of the report that I mentioned, I think we also introduced the likes of case studies, which is a way of sort of like when you've delivered a project at a site that was new and innovative or something that you've not done in the past. I think case studies are a really good way of showcasing the journey that you went on, the people that were impacted, and the value that you actually delivered. And in terms of the processes that I referred to just now, we wanted to make sure that carbon emissions and the success criteria for our business processes had reducing carbon sort of inbuilt at the start. Thanks, Joe. So what you can see here is an extract of our net zero strategy that our net zero lead put together, and it goes into a lot more detail off the back of this, but this was our sort of like high level sort of like roadmap that we could share with our various teams that are involved in some of this work, and as well as our key stakeholders. In terms of how we're going to try and get to net zero. So what we had outlined here are 3-year phases, and that is something that if you think about upgrading hospitals or trying to do some significant work within hospitals or large-scale buildings, you know that those things don't necessarily happen overnight. Those things could take a few years in planning. to actually sort of like replace assets because there's an operational impact. We didn't want to obviously impact any of our patients or the incredible staff that works at some of these sites. So all of these things need to be carefully planned in once we're going through our decarbonisation works. So we set up like 3-year phases, and those 3-year phases ramp up or ramp down depending on the sorts of work that we're doing and the types of buildings that we're working on, and the types of technologies that we wanted to implement at those points, because maybe they were a bit more mature compared to now. So that's how we sort of like started breaking this mammoth piece of work into that sort of journey. Thanks, Joe. And then similar to the end of year reports, this is what we started to produce from a case study perspective. Hopefully everyone's familiar with the purpose of case studies, but from a decarbonisation perspective, what we tried to do is inspire and share knowledge. We may have worked with a specific groups of people to deliver a piece of work, but what we wanted to try and do through these case studies is make sure that we wanted them, if they were doing something similar in their roles, be familiar with where we can decarbonize or reduce energy at our buildings using some of these simple steps. So we gave a background to the work that we did. The cost of the work, I think, is really important to make sure that you're being transparent with what the costs are of some of this work. As an example, on the top right-hand side there, a £200 sort of heating timer was able to cut our energy uses by 19%. So massive significant savings from an emission as well as a cost perspective in the utilities that health centre was actually using by using a simple thing like a heat timer. So we built a library of these things, and they're widely available to anyone within our organisation, as well as our customers and ICBs and GPs. If they also want to be aware of these things, we share that with them using monthly reports that we send them. We append some of our case studies to them as well. Thanks, Joe. So that's me done. In summary, hopefully you would have got a sense that if you're starting out these types of complex programs, I think number one is get your data in a healthy space. Confront the issues, build the improvements at pace. Don't wait for that perfect solution to be there. The decision making will come off the insights of the new ways of working, of the new data sources that you're starting to build. Introduce that structure at pace. It's like work with your teams, have those difficult discussions, but ultimately we want to try and get a joint agreement on what are your priorities and what are our priorities, using the budgets and using the resources that we have at hand. What can we what's the best use of our time and money to tackle each year as they come? And lastly, take your colleagues on that journey. It's like there's only so much that a greener team can do. It's like ultimately it's the organization's responsibility to make this happen. So it's what we wanted to do is create compelling success stories and show how relatively straightforward some of this work actually is, that you can actually start building that momentum within our organization, so it just becomes second nature and a culture that everyone else can do. Yeah, that's me, Joe. Thank you.
Noel. That was absolutely fantastic, and a fantastic example of resilience as well, in terms of, I think your Wi-Fi went down, you had a fire alarm, and we hadn't got your slides up and sharing at the beginning. So I think in terms of lessons learned, there's a certain amount of just kudos for the resilience there. Thank you so much for sharing those lessons with us. I think there was quite a lot to take away as well, in terms of making sure, and particularly sharing successes, because it's such a crucial part, isn't it, to remember how much has been achieved and how far you've come, and that other people can learn from them as well.
Yeah,
right.
I think being proud of the work that we do, right? It's like we all work on project programs, and we need to sort of like also tell others about like the value that we were part of and help deliver.
100%, and not overlooking that and forgetting it, because we get so bogged down in the detail and what's left to do that we forget, don't we, how far we've come. But there's nothing left for me to do other than to thank you very, very much. We really appreciated you coming back and sharing those lessons. Sorry we didn't have time to get to questions, folks, but we have run to time. Don't forget, we've got networking areas back in the main area. So if you all want to go and carry on that discussion, by all means do. Check the schedules for our other sessions as well. And please do visit our sponsors, because they do make the conference possible for all of us to join each year and learn so much from each other. If anyone is planning their next session, I have to let you know that our session from Daniello has been cancelled, but you can still join the next one, which is on leading cultural change through agility. But thank you, Noel. Really appreciate it. I hope we'll see you next year and the year after, and we're going to start wanting running totals and your shared successes for these projects. Perfect. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. We will see you in the next one.